Next presenter is Lucinda Hartley, the CEO and co-founder of the CoDesign studio. And if we accept that one of the key roles of local government is placemaking, and we've been talking about how to make sure the community has a voice in decision making, as we heard this morning, it's very important from Paul Leisner from Portland. They're very important to have perhaps early involvement of the community in the process rather than coming up with all the plans and asking the community their opinion. So when councils have placemaking plans, in many cases they have very big expert plans, designers, high-cost solutions. Lucinda's pioneered a sort of a tactical urbanism, a street activism approach, which is low cost, it's quick, and it's all driven by the community. So this is really a breakthrough that is really taking over very, very rapidly in many places around the world, and so Lucinda's one of the global pioneers. Can you please welcome Lucinda Hartley?
Thanks very much. I really have framed my talk today in the context of the neighbourhood, because I think when we talk about planning and placemaking, this is the building block of the city of where the rubber hits the road. It's more than your house and your street, but it's also less than your sort of council area plan. The thing about neighbourhoods is I think traditionally, we've always lived in neighbourhoods, and I like pulling up this plan. It's the early plan of Launceston. My great-grandfather was involved in the layout of Launceston, so there's a family connection there. But I think, sorry, just go back. We used to live in neighbourhoods much more than we do today, and that's partly a result of 50 years of car-oriented urban planning. It's partly a result of TV, it's partly a result of the internet, or maybe we just don't like our neighbours very much. But we have a problem on our hands. Statistically, only 1 in 6 Australians knows their neighbour. Now, that may not be the case for you, it's not the case for me, but that's a shocking statistic, that we are in fact facing an epidemic of social isolation in our neighbourhoods. And this affects the way that we build, that we plan, that we run our programs. But harking back to a concept of the neighbourhood as we think about it in the past, I think is false nostalgia, because the way that we live is different now and it's rapidly changing. If you think about the way that Gen Y and Z are communicating, are behaving and operating, the concept of a traditional neighbourhood in the future will be extremely different. But that said, we have lost our connection to localism and to each other. And reconnecting with our local neighbourhood is critical, not just for our well-being, but the whole way we plan our cities. Because even though I love to connect with people on Twitter and Facebook, these are people that I choose to engage with. It's the community that I choose to create. The amazing thing about a local neighbourhood is, like your family, you can't choose your neighbours. That you're put into a situation you're forced to deal with and collaborate with people who you might not like or you might not get along with or who might be very different from you. But it's in those strengths and connections that we form resilience and that we form a strong community. I want to talk about a project example that we worked on with Department of Justice in City of Moreland last year, which I think exemplifies some of these principles. Moreland has the largest network of bluestone laneways in the world. We may have some people from Moreland here today, I'm not sure. There's 67 kilometres. This amazing asset that was, they're 100 years old, they're not in great condition, and there was a council trial to look at... That's my phone, just sort of saying that's okay. Make sure yours is off. The council planned a trial to look at concreting them over because they needed maintenance and renewal, and that sparked a lot of backlash from the community. And there was a group who approached us called Save the Brunswick Bluestone Laneways Residents Group. They need to work on their branding a little, but they were a great group who really wanted to see how they could revitalise these laneways, and they managed to get them protected from concreting over, which is a great first step. But as you can see, They're not in great condition. They're sites of a lot of illegal dumping. This is in and around the area where Jill Ma, the ABC worker, was murdered a couple of years ago. And even though that hasn't increased the actual safety, there's a huge perception of safety in that area. So something needed to be done. So 2 neighbours came to us, and then we went to Department of Justice to get some funding, as you need to do, and looked at whether we could do a trial of how we could actually undertake a community-led upgrade of this laneway. So over 6 weeks, we worked with these 2 residents who then door knocked on all their neighbours and got a group of about 20 to 30 people together. And we started to think about what resources and assets we had in that area that we could use to transform this laneway. There were artists, there was a youth organisation, there were a range of people who wanted to cook and share and build community in this place. And we put that together into a 48-hour laneway blitz, if you like, where people came out and started to upgrade this laneway. Very simple tools. We looked at paint, we ran a community lunch, but there was a really interesting dynamic in that these 2 residents who were the only people who knew each other previously on this laneway were now working together with the whole laneway to upgrade it. This in particular was quite an exciting case study for me, as there's one lady who had a vacant plot of land, or her backyard essentially, that opened up onto this laneway. And she said through this process, you know, I'm going to develop this block one day, but it's just lying vacant at the moment. Why don't we take the fence down and turn it into a community garden? To which the youth organisation at the other end of the street said, hey, we're looking for more programs for our young people to get involved with. We'll come and maintain it for you. And the community built this in the weekend. This group we're still in touch with. They meet together now once a month in the laneway for a community dinner, and they regularly close it off on weekends for children's play. If you go on TripAdvisor and look at the Brunswick Laneways tours, which existed previously, but now they go down this laneway to look at some of the artwork that some of the artists put up on the walls and on the street as part of this program. And I think what's critical is this amazing amount of social capital built based on $5,000 worth of materials, 40-hour upgrade, and the entire project completed in less than 90 days. Interestingly, we received national media for this, which I'm not saying because I'm proud, it's just when they called us, we were just like, are you serious? This must be the slowest news day ever. But on reflection, I think what's interesting about this is so rarely do we see people taking responsibility for their neighbourhood, and more than just filling in a survey or registering a complaint, but actually getting together with their neighbours and say, we want to do something about this, and working out how to do it. And there's a few reasons why I think people don't do that, apart from feeling isolated in their community. One is, I think we've got really long-term planning processes that are very difficult for people to engage with day to day. It's not that we don't need long-term planning, it's just a difficult conversation to have. We also have, I think, to a large degree, lack of active citizenship, particularly with Gen Y and Gen Z. But in the context of both those things, we need to act really quickly because our cities are growing and changing really, really quickly. So how we can look at that? If we look at long-term planning horizons versus a fast-moving culture, we've got a challenge. One of them being that 80% of plans are never implemented. Now, I think we've seen some great case studies today of actual change being made, of plans hitting the ground, of a variety of different approaches being used. But generally, there's a lot of planning and replanning, and this can be frustrating for residents. We also design. I'm an urban designer by training, landscape architect. We make a huge amount of assumptions when we design places. We're doing it desktop, we're doing it removed from people that we're working with, and spend sometimes millions on places without any user testing. I'm going to talk about this more in a moment, but if you think about companies like Apple who built the iPhone, the reason it's so successful is through months and months of user testing and trying to get the product right for the customer. Yet when we're designing public space, we're quite happy to implement without that kind of level of user testing. Recently, we were part of a project with Vic Health, which some of you might have been a part of, which looked at funding for community activation projects for councils. The results haven't been announced yet. But what was interesting to me as being part of that judging panel, I thought that we would receive applications for underutilised spaces, sites of antisocial behaviour. At least 30% of the projects that we received were brand new public spaces that weren't working. that needed more funding for activation. So how can we actually get it right in the first place? And the other challenges on active citizenship versus engagement. I think we have city makers who are disconnected from their communities, and I'm drawing abstracts because this, of course, is not the case for everyone, and there's fantastic designers out there, and communities who are disconnected from city makers. Again, the case studies we've heard the last couple of days show how far we have come from regular town hall meetings, but still a long way to go. I think when we have a disconnected community, we have two byproducts of that. We hear too much from the loud voices on the one hand, the NIMBYs, and then we have huge demographics who are just not present at all. So I think one of the things, if we think about where placemaking fits or where neighbourhood renewal fits in this model of citizenship, in the model of city making, and I'm just breaking this down to probably the most basic concept of the city that you can possibly imagine, but that we have people existing in a place and connected by some sort of decision maker. It may be a council, but it could be the management committee for your community garden or a property developer, some sort of management involved. That we tend to have two pathways that we work through, that we have engagement, which is a relationship between people and government. We have design, which is a relationship between the place and governance. But what we actually need to do is both those things, yes, but actually really reconnect people to their place. And help, I guess, everyday citizens to take responsibility for city making as well. And this is the conversation that I think placemaking is about. It is a strategic process about designing place, but it's fundamentally about how we actually engage and motivate communities to be a part of that. We also need speed, and I think we heard some really fantastic presentations yesterday on uncertainty, on this unpredictability of the future. So how do we actually look at addressing some of those concepts around needing to engage people, needing to do more with less in an environment of extreme uncertainty? I think the great thing that we can look at, and perhaps one of the greatest lessons we can learn, is if we look at how businesses are adapting to uncertainty. If we look at what tech startups are doing, they are building businesses for a completely different market that never existed before, or selling a product like Facebook that didn't exist 10 years ago. How are they dealing with that uncertainty, and what can we learn from that approach for infrastructure and city making? If we look at, some of you might be familiar with these kinds of concepts around startup thinking. Eric Ries has written a very interesting book called The Lean Startup. In that he says, we must learn what customers really want, not what they say they want, or not what we think they should want. And when he's saying not what they say they want, he's mean not just what they say, but what they do, how they behave, user testing, prototyping, starting small and then scaling up. So if we look at a traditional planning model, which is focused more on design, planning and delivery, and it's, again, very abstract format, a startup model would say, don't plan too much, start small, test and measure the impact of what you've done, learn from that, and then when you've got really good proof of concept and evidence, to use that to scale up. Now, we can't just take one or other of these approaches when it comes to infrastructure and planning, because there are many complicated issues that require that long-term foresight. But there is something that we can learn from that agility of just starting. Key lessons that I think that planning and placemaking can learn from startup thinking is this. And one is around innovation. If you start small, you have an allowance for failure. You don't have to get it right. That gives you a huge amount of freedom to test and experiment and do things differently. The second thing is immediate action. You could actually deliver a project in 2 days. It's customer focused, so it's really trying to listen to what the customers want. It's flexible to change, but throughout all those smaller, quicker, cheaper approaches, it's looking at how we influence long-term strategic change. So how we take those lessons and inform something that we can scale up citywide. The last point that I've added there that Rees doesn't talk about, but I think it's interesting to note that predominantly in startup space, this is predominantly youth-led area. And perhaps there's this hold that we can mobilise and engage the energy of young people more in this as well. Which leads me to tactical urbanism. And essentially, to me, what this approach is startup for cities. If we take this small-scale, rapid prototyping-based approach to infrastructure and city making, then we have tactical urbanism. This is a term that was coined by Mike Lydon. He's a planning practitioner based out of New York City. He's recently put out a book called Tactical Urbanism, funnily enough. But his definition is this is a city and or citizen-led approach to neighbourhood building that uses short-term, low-cost and scalable interventions to catalyse long-term change. Now, these are small projects, but there are in fact many global cities who are using this approach to transform themselves right now. Let's look at Times Square in New York, for example. You may be very familiar with this case study, and I'll just touch on it briefly. Undoubtedly, you know where this place is. But this has been a hotspot of traffic accidents for a long time because Broadway crosses across the New York City grid. Since 1969, there has been a plan to close Broadway. It's come up in planning cycle after planning cycle and always hit some form of resistance that meant it couldn't go through, whether it was the taxi lobby or the traders or residents or other feedback. And not much happened until 2011. A group of residents connected by a Twitter campaign did this and just closed the street for a day with camping chairs. Now, this act had an incredible impact on the city government because it demonstrated to residents, to the government, to traders about what it would actually look and feel like if it was closed. It stopped being a line on a paper and started being something real. That led the government to look at a 3-month trial using just paint and folding chairs. They probably spent only a couple tens of thousands on this, where they could actually test out, well, what it would be like if there was a plaza. And the traders who were opposed to this space in the first instance found that their revenue went up between 20 and 40%. Traffic accidents went down between 10 and 30%. So they're able to see, based on quite a low-cost experiment, that this actually built the evidence that they needed to look at a permanent trial. So short-term action, long-term change. This transformation, and Times Square is currently under construction for a permanent plaza, happened in 18 months. So something that had been gridlocked in planning for half a century was unlocked through camping chairs. What tactical urbanism can do is it can act as that catalyst, that starting point, that can then enable your placemaking strategies to begin. We have so many placemaking strategies. We have so many great ideas about place activation, but we get stuck on delivery. Tactical urbanism takes that question out because it's low cost, it's low risk. You can begin. And those placemaking projects, in turn, help us develop sustainable and resilient places to live. Interestingly, this approach, while we might think of it as sort of guerrilla and fringe, it's being used by major cities. And Andreas Duani, perhaps one of the greatest proponents of sort of compact, walkable neighbourhoods and been a huge influence over urban planning over the last half century. His view of the future of urban planning is this: it's lean, guerrilla, incremental, vernacular, tactical. Just to contrast this, and I wouldn't advocate for a tactical or traditional planning approach, but I think traditional planning leaves us gaps that tactical can fill. If this is a table from my colleague David Week, but if you look at planned approach, it's led by experts typically. A tactical approach is led by users. A planned approach looks at analysis or trying to understand any issues in prior review, as a tactical is, well, let's experiment and then learn from that post-review. Planned approach looks at long-term horizons and can be slow, and tactical is fast, rigid and flexible. So talked about some international case studies, but this has been applied heavily locally. In our organisation, we've completed about 40 projects and from that come up with, I guess, some principles that we think are key to making those projects happen here, contextualised locally. And those are these. One is engaged community leadership, resource commitment, rapid prototyping, and long-term change. And I'm just going to show you a couple of case studies to highlight this. One is engaged community leadership, and we worked with Launceston City Council, no relationship to my family background, I must say. on the urban design framework for Project Launceston City Heart. It's a much broader project than just our scope, but what we were looking at doing is how do you actually engage an entire town, 10,000 people, in the development of an urban design framework. So we had the preliminary engagement, which looked at principles and themes. That's great, but these often can end up being motherhood statements that are very difficult to implement. So we tested it. We got a whole bunch of different prototyping elements, and we worked in key public spaces over several days to test out how different concepts would work. This, for example, was a series of play elements / chairs / other things that covered off on a few of the themes like playful city, more places to sit that were identified in the engagement. And what we found is that people moved these around over the day. They would move with the sun, people used them as play elements, and they break down a whole lot of barriers. In one instance, we had these on one instance down one of the mall areas where the traders were, as you might imagine, a little bit sceptical to begin with about what change was happening. And we were there for 3 consecutive days, and the first day they were inside, the second day they were poking their head out, the third day they were sitting on the chairs reading the newspaper, and when we went to pack them up there was another resident who came past and he's like, "What's going on here?" They're like, "I'll tell you what's going on." And they were able to give the residents the whole lowdown on what was happening here. But this actually gave us a real sense of grounded, tested criteria in which to inform the urban design framework. And that came from actually working with, rather than just asking the traders what they wanted or what they thought, letting them experience and test what was going to work for them. The second is resource commitment, and I guess this is looking at an asset-based approach of certainly there is service provision, there is infrastructure planning money on the table, but how can we actually leverage that with community support? Because when people are actually involved in volunteering, in funding and contributing to a project, their sense of ownership increases dramatically. I'm always inspired by what Jamie Lerner talks about, that if you want innovation, drop a zero off your budget. So it doesn't have to be huge amounts of funding involved. We worked on a project with a property developer in Collingwood, which is a vacant car parking space. It was going to be a building. It is currently being built into a building, but with many multi-storey developments like this, it was in planning for several years, and this had become a site of antisocial behaviour. So there wasn't a lot of money involved, but we looked at, hey, how could we actually get local residents together to turn this into something else? We went through a very complicated planning process, as you can see, with chalk on the ground, but actually tried to create a story of what this place could be that people could engage with. A lot of different groups donated materials. We sourced 500 red milk crates, which are still sitting in our office garage, if anyone wants any. And we created this great public space that was there for 3 months. It was open as a bar over the weekends. It ran as a prototype space for the School of Life. And a huge amount was achieved. We had 40 local volunteers come and contribute. And it really added a new lease of life to this otherwise problematic space in the neighbourhood. The third is rapid prototyping, and the 2 examples I've already given talk about rapid prototyping, but in particular, there's a whole lot of applications that this can have for behaviour change. This is a project that we worked on with City of Greater Geelong to prototype their bicycle network, to look just using temporary paint and bicycle-themed events to look at how people might interact. And it wasn't so much about the physical traffic measurements, but so much as how these types of elements can change people's behaviour towards cycling. And there were several people who were involved in these events who came down just to check it out, who now cycle to work because that was enough to unlock for them that it wasn't that difficult. Another sort of project was working with the Dodd Street in South Bank. We were working with City of Melbourne to test different ideas before investments were made to public open space. As with most places in Australia, if you take a car park out, the sky will fall. So talking about closing a street is always very controversial, but we were able to actually work with residents and businesses and the VCA campus on doing a series of prototypes for this street. It began with a simple closure that then led into a more formal design testing exercise. But we really were able to use this to say, well, the things that people wanted in this space is they wanted a place to sit, they wanted somewhere sheltered, they wanted somewhere cheap to buy food, so we formed a relationship with a food van and brought people together in a way that they never traditionally would have met to plan this space. But all of these contribute to long-term change, and I'll just touch on that briefly. The School of Life, it was about a prototype and activating underutilised space, but it was also a prototype for the School of Life business model. They ran their workshop space out of there for 3 months, and they now have a permanent home on Burke Street after their sell-out program in the prototype. The Dodd Street project, it was a change management exercise around how do we actually go from turning a street into a park, but has actually substantially influenced the South Bank Master Plan and how that's being rolled out. And there are many other long-term examples. I guess having done a bunch of our own projects, we wanted to get a handle on how this was playing out in a movement in Australia and New Zealand. And last year, our office put out a free guidebook called, funnily enough, the Tactical Urbanism Guide to Australia and New Zealand. When I was telling my uncle that we'd written a book, he said, "What's it called?" And I said, "Oh, it's the Tactical Urbanism Guide to Australia and New Zealand." And he's like, big pause. Would I find that on the bookshelf near the New South Wales Guide to Eastern Grey Cockatoos or something super specific like that? Perhaps. But the reason that we put this book together was actually to say, this isn't just something that's happening in Melbourne, it's not just something happening in Christchurch, because there's some great examples there. This is actually an approach to city making that's being used in big cities, in small towns, in urban areas, in greenfield areas. And these are some things that we found. There's 5 key principles that we look in these Australian projects and New Zealand projects. They all involve short-term action. They all involve a highly participatory approach. They all involve a strategic long-term intent, and that's critical because pop-ups are extremely trendy and hipster and cool and fun, and that's great, but I think pop-ups are a fad, honestly. But I think what the pop-ups can do if they're strategically used is they can influence strategic long-term change, and that is critical. They have measurable impact, and I haven't talked about measurement today, but the purpose of doing a prototype is to measure the impact. And the 5th thing, which is only for Australia and New Zealand, which I find really funny, because this guidebook is the 4th in a series of guidebooks that have looked at documenting this approach in North America, in Latin America, most of which in that context, these projects are done guerrilla. They're sort of illegal, unsanctioned projects, but here we're all too afraid to break the rules. Everyone's got a permit of some sort, which is funny. And good in many ways, because that shows that we're working, I think, more collaboratively. The other thing is, like, who is a tactical urbanist? This isn't just a residents thing, although that is its main objective. Councils are using this approach. Communities are using this approach, property developers and consultants. It opens up the conversation about who is the city maker, and that's what I think is really interesting. Not without its challenges. I'll touch on a few. I mentioned that everyone's got permits here mostly, but that in itself can be quite a challenge. These projects really fall between traditional systems. You're probably not complicated enough to need a development application, well, I hope not, but not quite an event either. So where do you put it? We typically try and use whatever existing framework or policy exists. You've got no idea how far we have stretched what's defined as an event. As well as looking at things like your existing street party permits, for example, and how they can be adapted. So the critical thing here is that we don't necessarily need huge new policy frameworks. We can look at adapting procedures. That said, we had a situation with our own local council recently where we were running a street-wide garage sale outside our office as part of an in-house office project. And we asked our council for permission to close a couple of car parks for the day to create a space to run this garage sale as a little park. After 3 months, we got a no, so that was nice. At least we tried. But it turns out you can get a skip permit for $20. And we did it anyway. But the critical thing that I want to highlight about this is that it is really easy to put a rubbish bin in the street. It was $20 and one phone call. There's a permit procedure, there's a standardised process. If you want to make something that easy, you can. And you already have the systems to do it in other areas of your council that you can learn from. Incidentally, this accidentally, to us, got picked up by Triple M, Herald Sun, Daily Mail. If you look at skipsters, you'll find a whole bunch of Collingwood hipsters sitting in a skip. That was us. Managing risk. Risk is always a question that comes up, but I think the thing to remember is relative to a lot of council programs, these are very low risk projects. You can also look at co-managing risk with the community, but fundamentally you are reducing your overall risk, I believe, because you are testing before you're investing, that you're spending $10,000 up front in order to not have $1 million park that you need to spend money activating later on. Investing in engagement, yeah, sure, it's more expensive up front, definitely. But if you could get great results for a long-term infrastructure project for less than 30 grand and in less than 90 days, that's pretty good value. And getting it the first time is a lot cheaper. So how do you scale this up? We've talked about a lot of small projects. Up to 30% of land in Australian cities is vacant or underutilised. We've got a growing population, growing service needs. This has the potential to become the largest network of public open spaces in Australia, if we think critically about how we use them and how we work with our residents and neighbours to co-manage them. Simple? Could be. I think the critical role in any of these projects is looking at councils as an enabler of change. Many residents begin these projects, they might get a no from their council, they might get a yes, but paving that pathway is such an important area. One of our colleagues spent a long time working with Brisbane City Council and their Laneways strategy, and they fundamentally, in order to make that happen, looked at this sort of axis shift where councils typically are very good at planning and regulating and very good at providing, but less familiar with facilitating and coordinating. But we have heard some great strategies in the last 2 days about a variety of different ways to look at that. So how do we become facilitators and coordinators? Requires internal leadership. I'm assuming that that's you in the room as elected officials, senior managers. It takes electoral leadership. It takes residents stepping up as well. Also, a key driver of change is critical mass. And we've seen this with many different changes that have happened in local government, that there's a few that begin and can pave the way for others to follow. But looking in internal leadership, just some of the councils that we worked with, and I am finishing now because we want to finish on time today, that it's not that difficult. The first thing is looking at adapted procedures. And I mentioned before, it's not always about policy creation. You could look at changing your event permits and suddenly these projects would be possible. You could look at changing liquor licensing. It's that kind of thing that will activate rather than another 20-year plan. It does require new skills within council teams often to look at working and managing these projects differently. And I'll just jump, I was just thinking, I was going to skip over this, but I think it's interesting to look at what Detroit has done around managing and reducing red tape. They call it pink tape. And Andreas Dewani with the Lean Urbanism Institute has been looking at ways to activate a city that's bankrupt by reducing some of those policies. We've been working with Brimbank City Council and a couple of others on, I guess, a skills program that involves half the participants are from council, but half are from the community, and they're working together on the same project. So this is great skills sharing that's going on in terms of creating places at the same time. And simple toolkit, making things predictable and low risk. So perhaps you don't want to open everything up to prototyping. Perhaps you want to say it needs to be within your verges or it needs to be within a parklet confines, and you can look at guidelines, and San Francisco, LA City Council, many others have put out these kinds of guidelines that can limit the risk. We're working on similar guidelines for parklets and play streets at the moment with a couple of councils to sort of de-risk that process. So I'm going to do something I've never done before today. It's the second afternoon of a 2-day conference, so you'll be tired and you weren't expecting to participate now, but this won't take long. I'm interested to think about if any of this has inspired you today, what could you do in the next 90 days? And I mean that in a role professionally, but also perhaps as a resident, as a citizen. And looking at this concept of we need a critical mass of people in order to reinvent our neighbourhoods. And there might be some different ways you want to reflect on that. You would have noticed on your chair or on your table a postcard here, which just has some options if this is resonated with you in some way today, that maybe you've never heard of tactical urbanism before, that's fair enough. That's just more jargon to add into our planning language. But essentially, as an approach to reinventing neighbourhoods, it's very interesting. Maybe you want to learn more. Maybe you want to attend a training. We're running some trainings in June in Melbourne and Sydney, but also can run masterclasses. And there's some information that we can send you some information about that. But actually what we're really interested is our vision is to really see a group of councils come together to prototype and trial this approach, to look at how it's going to actually embed into systems and processes to help communities do more. If any of those three are of interest, and it doesn't have to be, as I said, it's the end of the second, there's the opportunity on the back of that postcard to tick one of those boxes. And we can be in touch with you. My colleague Sam's down by the door if you want to have those postcards at the end. But I think I'm always inspired when thinking about tiny projects by a philosopher that I've read a lot of work about, Margaret Mead, who you may know, 20th century philosopher, but she says that we should never doubt that a small group of committed people can change the world because it's the only thing that ever has. Thanks very much.
And I probably should say that the CoDesign Studio is a social enterprise non-profit organisation. So got time for a couple of quick questions of Lucinda. If anyone wants to know about this new low-cost way of regenerating, revitalising urban landscapes.
G'day, Thomas from Glenarry City Council in Victoria. I raised pop-up park type scenarios and activation issues with my staff and my community, and one of the responses I got I categorised as a dead bat. Basically, too much stuff to store and it's not going to get used much. Could you comment?
As in having a kit of parts that could be used for pop-up things? Sure. I think there's always risks in any of these kinds of projects, but I think you need to test it and see, and it can be really small. We have a garage full of pop-up parts in our office, and we use them every week. People call us up all the time wanting to borrow it, so I think that the need is actually there. But it could be that you start really small with a smaller kit of parts and see how it works, and then if you get traction to get some more. But I think having a council as a host of that kind of material actually takes a lot of the barriers out for residents who want to, say, try a parklet, try a pop-up park, but aren't quite going to get that leap to make that first step, and council can be an enabler in that environment. So I think you could probably do it for less than 5,000. Yep.
Can you please give us your thoughts on the demographics who are attracted by this? I imagine it would be very appealing to X and Y demographics.
Oh. Yeah, we work with a range of different demographics, and I've probably shown some more urban projects today, but we're working on projects with young families in greenfield areas. We're working with very diverse multicultural communities. We've worked with the North Richmond Housing Estate on different projects. So I actually think that it appeals to a range of different people, and it's about selecting a project type that's right for that demographic. Sure, like milk crates, AstroTurf, that's great in Collingwood, wonderful. You might use the same methodology, but completely different kit of parts if you're working in the North Richmond Housing Estate, for example. So we find there's quite good interest across, and probably what it brings out is we find that over 90% of people who engage with our projects have never engaged with council before. So it's getting a window of different people. Yep.
Okay, look, we might call it quits there in the interest of time. Can we please thank Lucinda Hartley?